walked into a dead-end alley at 3:24 a.m. Nobody ever saw him again. At 3:24 in the morning, a surveillance camera captured 23-year-old Royal Air Force serviceman Corrie McKeague walking into a small service area behind a row of shops in the English town of Bury St Edmunds. The footage lasts only a few seconds. Corrie appears relaxed. He isn't running. He isn't hiding. He isn't being chased. He simply walks into the alley. Under normal circumstances, that moment would have been completely forgettable. But investigators would later discover something deeply unsettling. The alley had multiple exits. Cameras monitored the surrounding streets. Anyone leaving should have been seen. Yet after Corrie entered, he was never captured on camera again. Not once. No footage showed him leaving. No witness reported seeing him. No phone call followed. No bank card was ever used. No verified sighting was ever confirmed. It was as if he had simply stepped into a blind spot in reality and vanished. Nearly a decade later, investigators still cannot prove exactly what happened during the final minutes of his life. Some believe he died in a tragic accident. Others think crucial evidence was overlooked. And for many people who have studied the case, one disturbing question remains unanswered. How does a young man disappear in a town covered by cameras? This is the disappearance of Corrie McKeague, and the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the story became. September 23, 2016. The mystery began on what should have been a completely ordinary Friday night. Corrie McKeague was 23 years old. He served in the Royal Air Force and was stationed at RAF Honington in Suffolk. Friends described him as energetic, charismatic, fearless, and impossible to ignore. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. The kind of person who never stayed quiet for long, and the kind of person who almost never spent a Friday night at home. That evening, Corrie planned to meet friends in Bury St Edmunds, a historic market town roughly 10 miles from the airbase. The group intended to spend the night moving between pubs, bars, and clubs. A normal night out, nothing unusual, nothing memorable. At least that's how it seemed at the time. The evening almost didn't happen. Each member of the group assumed someone else would pick Corrie up. Nobody did. For many people, that would have ruined the plan. For Corrie, it was barely an inconvenience. He simply got into his BMW and drove himself. At around 10 p.m., after parking in town, he called his younger brother Derek. The conversation lasted only a short time. Corrie sounded relaxed, happy, completely normal. He sat in his car drinking red wine while chatting casually about life. Years later, that phone call would become one of the last moments when somebody could say with certainty that everything seemed fine. There was no sign of distress, no indication of fear, no hint that within a few hours he would become the center of one of Britain's most puzzling missing person cases. The man everyone noticed. To understand why this disappearance captured so much attention, it helps to understand who Corrie was. Some people blend into crowds. Corrie did the opposite. People remembered him, not because he tried to impress anyone, not because he demanded attention, but because attention seemed to follow him naturally. He had a quick sense of humor. He talked to strangers effortlessly. He made friends wherever he went. And on that September night, he was in his element. As bars filled with people and music echoed through the streets, Corrie moved through the town exactly as he always had, laughing, talking, meeting people, enjoying himself. Then something happened that perfectly captured his personality. At one of the venues, a local musician named Nick Lowy was performing live. Corrie approached him with an unusual request. He wanted to sing. Not a modern song, not a drunken karaoke favorite, a 1940s swing classic called Chattanooga Choo Choo. Nick assumed it would be a joke. It wasn't. To everyone's surprise, Corrie knew every word. The two launched into an impromptu duet. People stopped what they were doing and watched. When the song ended, applause erupted across the venue. Nick would later recall being genuinely stunned. He knew every single lyric. When we finished, Everyone started clapping. I remember thinking, where did that come from? For a few minutes, Corrie became the center of the room. Again, nobody knew they were watching one of the final carefree moments of his life. The night continues. After the performance, the night rolled on. Corrie and his friends moved between venues, drifting through the crowded streets of Bury St Edmunds as the hours passed. To everyone around him, he appeared exactly as he always did on a night out. Confident, social, carefree. But as midnight approached, another factor began influencing the night. Alcohol. Quite a lot of it. Witnesses later described Corrie as being in high spirits, but increasingly intoxicated. At around 11:30 p.m., the group arrived at a Wetherspoons pub. Inside, Corrie immediately began doing what he did best. He circulated. One moment he was talking to friends, the next he was greeting someone across the room. Then he was introducing himself to people he had never met before. Bar worker Megan Manning would later remember him clearly, not because of any argument, not because of any incident, simply because he seemed to know everyone, or at least acted like he did. He was walking around saying hello to lots of people. He seemed happy, very friendly, very sociable. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nothing suggested danger was approaching. Nothing suggested that investigators would later spend years dissecting every minute of this evening. At around 12:30 a.m., Corrie and his friends moved on once again. Their next stop was a nightclub called Flex, and this is where the timeline begins to change. The last time his friends saw him. When Corrie entered Flex, staff immediately noticed his condition. He stumbled. Not dramatically, but enough to attract attention. The club manager asked him a simple question. Was he drunk? Corrie answered honestly, yes. About 30 minutes later, security staff saw him nearly lose his balance again. This time they made a decision. He had reached his limit. The guard told him he would have to leave. What happened next might seem insignificant, but in hindsight, it became one of the most important moments of the entire case. Corrie left the nightclub alone. No friends accompanied him. No one checked where he was going. No one followed. And strangely enough, nobody thought much about it. That wasn't because they didn't care. It was because Corrie often did this. He would disappear from one group and turn up somewhere else entirely. It was normal behavior for him. His friends assumed they would see him later. Instead, they would never see him again. The last confirmed hours. After leaving the club, Corrie headed toward one of his favorite late-night food spots, a small takeaway called Pizza Mamma Mia. It was here that some of the final confirmed sightings occurred. Employees remembered him. Customers remembered him. Security cameras remembered him. Corrie ordered an enormous amount of food, 2 burgers, a kebab, a portion of fries. Enough food that some witnesses later laughed when describing it. Despite his intoxication, he appeared cheerful, relaxed. At one point, he even played a quick game of rock, paper, scissors with a stranger while waiting for his order. There was no sign of panic, no visible distress, no indication that he felt threatened. In fact, if someone had asked witnesses that night whether Corrie seemed happy, most likely they would have answered yes. Very happy. When his food was ready, he left the takeaway and walked into the cooling darkness of the early morning. It was now after 2 a.m. The crowds were beginning to thin. The atmosphere of the town was changing. The energy of Friday night was slowly giving way to the emptiness before dawn. Most people were heading home. Some were sleeping. Others were preparing for work. Corrie continued walking, alone. The steps. Eventually, he reached the entrance of a closed electronics store. The building was dark. The street was quiet. The steps outside provided a place to sit, and so he sat down to eat. Security footage later showed him remaining there for a considerable amount of time, finishing his food, relaxing, watching the nearly empty street. Then, sometime afterward, he stretched out across the steps and fell asleep for nearly 2 hours. This detail often surprises people because when discussing disappearances, it's natural to imagine something dramatic, a confrontation, a kidnapping, a sudden attack. But Corrie's final known hours were almost painfully ordinary. A young man, too much alcohol, late-night food, a quiet street, and an unexpected nap before sunrise. Yet those hours would become some of the most scrutinized in modern British investigative history. Every second of footage would later be examined, every movement analyzed, every possibility debated, because somewhere after this moment, the mystery begins. The text message. At approximately 3:08 a.m., a text message was sent from Corrie's phone. At first glance, this seemed unremarkable. People send texts all the time. But investigators would later discover something odd. CCTV footage didn't clearly show Corrie actively using his phone at that exact moment. The discrepancy was small, yet in a case where every minute mattered, even small discrepancies attracted attention. Could the message have been typed earlier and sent later? Had he briefly woken up? Was the timestamp misleading? The answer was never entirely clear. But what mattered most was not the message itself. It was the timing. Because only 16 minutes later, Corrie would walk into the location that transformed a missing person case into a national mystery. A place known as the Horseshoe, the place where the trail ends. At 3:24 a.m., CCTV cameras captured Corrie entering a service area behind several businesses. Locals knew it as the Horseshoe. The name sounds almost picturesque. The reality was anything but. The area was ugly, industrial, forgotten. A place most people would pass without a second glance. Large dumpsters stood against the walls. Waste containers overflowed with garbage. Delivery vehicles used it during business hours. At night, it was mostly empty. And importantly, the Horseshoe itself had no CCTV cameras, but the surrounding streets did, lots of them. Investigators would later realize something chilling. They could clearly see Corrie entering the area. They should have been able to see him leave. Yet after entering the Horseshoe, Corrie McKeague was never seen on camera again. Not walking away, not crossing a nearby street, not entering another building, nothing. The footage simply ends, as though the story itself had been cut apart. And this is where the case truly begins. Because if Corrie didn't leave on foot, how did he leave at all? The alley nobody could explain. The Horseshoe wasn't hidden, it wasn't secret, and it certainly wasn't large. That's what made the situation so difficult for investigators to understand. When most people imagine a disappearance, they picture forests, mountains, isolated highways, or abandoned buildings stretching for miles. The Horseshoe was none of those things. It was a relatively small service area behind a row of businesses. If Corrie had entered and then walked back out, someone should have seen him. Or at the very least, a camera should have. Yet that never happened. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the timeline became. They reviewed the footage once, then again, then dozens of times, frame by frame, second by second, looking for anything they might have missed. A shadow, a reflection, a movement in the distance, anything. Nothing appeared. Corrie entered. Then the trail simply stopped. For experienced investigators, that was deeply unsettling. People rarely vanish without leaving evidence. Usually there is a mistake, a witness overlooked, a camera angle missed, a transaction, a phone call, something. But in this case, every answer seemed to create two new questions. And soon, another piece of evidence emerged, one that would completely reshape the investigation. The phone signal. Corrie's mobile phone continued generating data after he entered the Horseshoe. At first, detectives believed this might help them solve the mystery quickly. Instead, it complicated everything. The signal suggested movement, not random movement, not movement in circles, movement away from the Horseshoe, eastward. Following a route Corrie himself was unlikely to have taken on foot. The data wasn't perfect. Mobile phone records rarely are. But it suggested something important. His phone appeared to be traveling. The obvious question became, traveling with whom? Or with what? At first, investigators explored every possibility. Perhaps Corrie had left through an unseen route. Perhaps he had entered a vehicle. Perhaps he had met someone. Perhaps the data itself was misleading. Every option remained on the table. Then detectives noticed something that made them pause. The route seemed to overlap with the path taken by a garbage collection truck operating in the area that morning. Initially, the connection sounded almost ridiculous, the kind of theory people dismiss immediately. But then, more evidence began pointing in the same direction, and what started as an unlikely possibility slowly became the center of the entire investigation. The theory nobody wanted. Investigators began reconstructing the early morning activities inside the horseshoe. Among the dumpsters present that night was a commercial waste container used by a nearby bakery. Large, enclosed, easy to climb into, especially for someone heavily intoxicated. The theory that emerged was disturbing. After eating a huge amount of food and spending hours drinking, Corrie may have entered one of the dumpsters and fallen asleep. It sounds irrational, until you remember the circumstances. It was after 3 a.m. The town was quiet. The temperature was dropping. Corrie was exhausted. He had already spent hours sleeping on outdoor steps, and people under the influence do strange things. Things that seem incomprehensible when viewed later from the safety of daylight. If Corrie climbed into the dumpster seeking shelter, warmth, or simply privacy, he might have remained there unnoticed. Then, sometime later, the garbage truck arrived. The container was emptied, and nobody realized a person might be inside. The scenario was horrifying, but investigators couldn't ignore it, because increasingly, the evidence appeared to support it. Then came the weight data. The breakthrough seemed to arrive when detectives examined records from the garbage truck itself. Modern refuse vehicles routinely track collection information, including weight. When investigators reviewed the data from the morning Corrie disappeared, something immediately stood out. The truck's recorded weight increased significantly after collecting waste from the horseshoe. More than expected, more than normal, enough to attract attention. Suddenly, the theory no longer sounded like wild speculation. For detectives, this became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the case. The timeline fit, the route fit, the phone data fit, and now the weight figures appeared to fit as well. For the first time, investigators believed they might know what happened. But there was a terrible problem. Knowing where someone might have gone is not the same as finding them, and by the time police focused on this theory, precious time had already been lost. Days, entire days. The waste collected that morning was long gone, transported to a landfill site containing thousands upon thousands of tons of garbage. If Corrie was there, recovering evidence would be extraordinarily difficult. But investigators had little choice. The landfill became their next destination. Meanwhile, his family refused to stop searching. While detectives developed their theory, Corrie's family was living a different reality. Every morning began with hope. Every evening ended without answers. His mother, Nicola, understood investigations. She had worked in law enforcement herself. She knew how evidence was gathered. She knew how leads were followed. And she knew that sometimes the most terrifying thing in an investigation is not discovering bad news. It's discovering nothing at all. No activity on bank accounts, no phone calls, no social media activity, no verified sightings, no indication that Corrie was alive. Yet there was also no proof that he was dead. The uncertainty became unbearable. Friends organized searches. Volunteers distributed posters. People across the country began following the story. The case was growing larger. The media coverage was growing larger. And the pressure on investigators was growing larger. Everyone wanted the same thing. An answer. Any answer. Instead, the mystery only became deeper. Because the more evidence police collected, the less certain the picture seemed to become. One detail kept haunting investigators. Even as attention shifted toward the landfill theory, a single question continued bothering detectives. Why did Corrie enter the horseshoe in the first place? Not how, not where. Why? This question may sound simple, but it sits at the center of the entire mystery. If investigators could understand his reason for entering that service area, they might understand everything that followed. Was he looking for somewhere to sleep? Trying to avoid the cold? Searching for privacy? Meeting someone? Taking a shortcut? Nobody knew. And because nobody knew, every theory contained a gap, a missing piece, a blank space where certainty should have been. That blank space remains there today, waiting, unanswered. The next phase of the investigation would involve one of the largest landfill searches Britain had ever seen. Millions of pounds would be spent, thousands of tons of waste would be examined, months would pass. And yet, what investigators discovered there would only deepen the mystery. The search that cost millions. By the time investigators focused on the landfill theory, weeks had already passed. If Corrie had truly been transported there inside a garbage truck, finding him would be extraordinarily difficult. Yet police believed they had enough evidence to try. What followed became one of the largest and most expensive missing person searches in British history. Their target was a massive landfill site near Cambridge, known as Milton Landfill. From a distance, the location looked almost endless. Mountains of waste stretched across the landscape. Every day, new garbage arrived. Every day, older layers were compressed, buried, and covered. For search teams, it was a nightmare environment. Imagine dropping a single coin into an ocean and then being asked to recover it weeks later. That gives some idea of the challenge investigators faced. Yet, despite the odds, the operation moved forward. Heavy machinery arrived. Specialist teams were assembled. Search zones were mapped. Large sections of the landfill were excavated, and for months, workers dug through mountains of waste looking for one missing man. The public believed the mystery was almost solved. At first, many people thought investigators were close to an answer. The evidence seemed persuasive. Corrie entered the horseshoe. His phone appeared to move along a garbage collection route. A dumpster was emptied shortly afterward. The truck's weight data appeared unusual. The theory felt logical, complete, even inevitable. Many observers assumed the search would eventually recover evidence confirming what had happened. It seemed like a matter of time. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The search continued. And then, something unexpected happened. Nothing was found. Not Corrie, not his clothing, not his phone, not his wallet. Nothing. The absence of evidence began creating a new mystery. If the theory was correct, where was the proof? The weight data starts falling apart. Then investigators encountered another problem, a serious one. Experts re-examined the garbage truck's weight records. The figures that had initially appeared so convincing were subjected to deeper analysis. And suddenly, confidence began to weaken. The weighing system on the truck wasn't designed for homicide investigations. It was designed for waste management. Minor inaccuracies could occur. Environmental factors could affect readings. Mechanical variables could influence results. Load distribution could change calculations. The further specialists dug into the data, the less certain it became that the weight increase was as significant as originally believed. This didn't completely destroy the garbage truck theory, but it damaged one of its strongest supporting pillars. The investigation had spent months treating the weight anomaly as a critical clue. Now that clue appeared far less reliable. For some observers, this changed everything. A family begins to doubt. Nobody felt that uncertainty more strongly than Corrie's mother. Nicola had supported the investigation from the beginning. She wanted answers as desperately as anyone. But increasingly, she found herself asking difficult questions. Questions that many members of the public were also beginning to ask. Where was the direct evidence? Not assumptions, not probabilities, not reconstructions. Evidence. Nobody had seen Corrie climb into a dumpster. No CCTV camera captured it. No witness reported it. No forensic evidence placed him inside any container. The entire scenario rested on circumstantial evidence, a chain of events that seemed plausible, perhaps even likely, but still unproven. For Nicola, that distinction mattered enormously, because once investigators commit to a theory, there is always a risk. The risk that alternative explanations receive less attention. And if the chosen theory is wrong, crucial opportunities may be missed. Over time, tensions between the family and investigators became increasingly visible, not because the family believed police were acting in bad faith, but because everyone was confronting the same frustrating reality. No one actually knew what happened. Alternative theories begin to spread. Whenever a mystery remains unsolved, people start filling the gaps themselves. The disappearance of Corrie McKeague was no exception. As media coverage expanded, alternative explanations emerged from every direction. Some seemed reasonable, others sounded like something from a crime novel. One theory suggested Corrie encountered someone inside or near the horseshoe. The location's reputation attracted attention. Could he have crossed paths with the wrong person? Could an argument have escalated? Would a crime have occurred out of sight of the cameras? Investigators examined these possibilities extensively. No evidence supported them. Another theory suggested Corrie chose to disappear voluntarily. Supporters pointed to the pressures in his life, an unexpected child on the way, relationships, future responsibilities. Maybe he simply walked away, but again, the evidence refused to cooperate. His bank accounts remained untouched. His passport wasn't used. There were no confirmed sightings, no communication, no financial activity, no trace of someone building a new life. Then came even more speculative ideas: abduction, a secret relationship, online contacts, criminal involvement, a chance encounter gone wrong. Each theory attracted believers. Each theory generated headlines. Each theory eventually ran into the same obstacle: a lack of evidence. The question that never went away. Years later, many investigators would admit that one aspect of the case continued to trouble them more than any other. Not the landfill, not the dumpsters, not the phone data, not the cameras. The real problem was much simpler. Nobody could explain Corrie's intentions. Think about it. The entire mystery begins with a decision, a seemingly insignificant decision. At 3:24 a.m., Corrie walks into the horseshoe. Why? What was he trying to do? Where did he think he was going? What did he expect to find there? Those questions remain unanswered. And because they remain unanswered, every explanation feels incomplete, like a puzzle missing its centerpiece. Investigators know where Corrie was. They know approximately when he arrived. They know what happened before. But they still don't know why he entered that alley. And without that answer, the final chapter of the story remains hidden in darkness. The next stage of the case would become even more controversial. Because despite years of investigation, police would eventually reach a conclusion that many people accepted and many others never fully believed. The official conclusion. Years passed. Investigators revisited evidence, rechecked timelines, reviewed phone records, examined witness statements again and again. Every promising lead eventually reached the same destination: a dead end. No major breakthrough ever arrived. No hidden witness suddenly came forward. No confession emerged. No new piece of evidence fundamentally changed the case. And gradually, the official position became clear. Police concluded that the most likely explanation was still the garbage truck theory. Not because it was perfect, not because every question had been answered, but because it fit more of the available evidence than any competing explanation. According to investigators, the most probable sequence of events looked something like this. After entering the horseshoe, Corrie climbed into a commercial dumpster. Perhaps he was exhausted. Perhaps he was seeking shelter. Perhaps he simply wanted somewhere private to sleep. Whatever the reason, investigators believed he remained inside. A refuse collection truck arrived later that morning. The dumpster was emptied, and Corrie was unknowingly transported away with the waste. His phone data appeared consistent with the truck's route. The timing matched, the movements matched, and despite all its flaws, no alternative theory explained the evidence more convincingly. For police, that became the answer. But there was a problem, a very important one. The answer was never proven. The missing piece. Imagine reading the final chapter of a mystery novel and discovering that the last few pages are gone. You might have a good idea how the story ends. You might even be fairly certain. But certainty is not proof. And proof was exactly what remained missing. No camera recorded Corrie entering a dumpster. No witness saw him climb inside. No forensic evidence directly connected him to any waste container. No physical remains were ever recovered. Nothing definitively established what happened during those final, unseen minutes. As a result, the case exists in an unusual space. Officially, investigators have a likely explanation. Emotionally, many people still feel the mystery remains unsolved. Because the central event itself was never observed, it was reconstructed, inferred, pieced together from fragments. And reconstructed stories always leave room for doubt. The family's unfinished story. For Corrie's family, that doubt never disappeared. How could it? Every parent wants certainty, even painful certainty, especially painful certainty, because certainty allows grief to move forward. Uncertainty traps it in place. For years, Corrie's loved ones continued searching for answers, continued examining evidence, continued asking questions, not necessarily because they believed police were wrong, but because they knew there was still a difference between what was believed and what was proven. And that difference matters when the missing person is your son, your brother, your family. As time passed, public attention slowly faded. News coverage decreased. Headlines became less frequent. The world moved on. Families rarely have that luxury. For them, the story never truly ends. It simply becomes quieter. The most disturbing part of the entire case. Many missing person investigations contain a moment where everything changes. A struggle, a witness, a crime scene, a mistake, some identifiable turning point. The disappearance of Corrie McKeague is different, because the most important moment in the case appears completely ordinary. A young man walks into an alley. That's it. No visible danger, no visible threat, no sign of violence, nothing that would make an observer stop and pay attention. And yet, that ordinary moment became the dividing line between two realities: the life everyone knew and the mystery that followed. Perhaps that's why the case continues to fascinate people, not because of what investigators found, but because of what they didn't. Because despite thousands of hours of work, millions of pounds spent, countless interviews, extensive forensic searches, and years of analysis, nobody can fully explain what happened during those final minutes. One last question. Try to imagine the scene. It's 3:24 in the morning. The town is almost asleep. The streets are mostly empty. The bars are closing. The noise of the night is fading. A young Royal Air Force serviceman walks through the darkness after a night out. He's tired. He's intoxicated. He's alone. A camera watches him enter a service area called the Horseshoe. Then he disappears. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. The cameras never see him again. The witnesses never see him again. The world never sees him again. And nearly 10 years later, one question still hangs over the case. Was the accepted explanation correct, or does a crucial piece of the story remain hidden somewhere inside those missing minutes? No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. But until that final question is answered, the disappearance of Corrie McKeague will remain what it has been since the morning of September 24, 2016, one of Britain's most haunting modern mysteries.